So now let's look at energy flow and chemical cycling in ecosystems.
So in this lecture, we'll look at 5 key core concepts. In concept number 1, we'll look at physical laws governing energy flow and chemical cycling in ecosystems. In key concept number 2, we'll look at energy and other limiting factors controlling primary production in ecosystems. In key concept number 3, we'll look at energy transfer between trophic levels.
In key concept number 4, we'll look at biochemical and geochemical processes, cycle nutrients and water in ecosystems. And finally, in key concept number 5, we'll look at restoration ecologists and how they return degraded ecosystems to a more natural state.
So before we look at ecosystems, we must define what they are. So the definition of an ecosystem. An ecosystem is the sum of all the organisms living in a given area and the abiotic factors with which they interact. An ecosystem, regardless of its size, has 2 key emergent properties: energy flow and recycling.
An ecosystem, regardless of its size, has 2 key emergent properties: energy flow and chemical cycling. Energy enters most ecosystems as sunlight. This light energy is converted to chemical energy by autotrophs, passed to heterotrophs in the organic compounds of food, and dissipated as heat. To study energy flow and chemical cycling, ecosystem ecologists use approaches based on laws of physics and chemistry. The first law of thermodynamics states that energy cannot be created or destroyed, but only transferred or transformed. The amount of energy stored in organic molecules must equal the total solar energy intercepted by the plant minus the amounts reflected and dissipated as heat. The second law of thermodynamics states that every exchange of energy increases the entropy of the universe. Some energy is always lost as heat. Thus energy flows through the ecosystems. It does not cycle within them for long periods of time. Matter, like energy, cannot be created or destroyed. This law of conservation of mass is as important for ecosystems as are the laws of thermodynamics. Unlike energy, chemical elements are continually recycled within ecosystems. In addition to cycling within ecosystems, elements can also be gained or lost by an ecosystem. Most gains and losses to ecosystems are small compared to the amounts that cycle within them.
Ecologists assign species to trophic levels on the basis of their main source of nutrition and energy. The trophic level that ultimately supports all others consists of autotrophs, also called the primary producers of the ecosystem. Most autotrophs are photosynthetic organisms that use light to synthesize sugars and organic compounds, which they then use as fuel for cellular respiration and as building material for growth. Organisms in trophic levels above the primary producers are heterotrophs, which directly or indirectly depend on the biosynthetic output of primary producers. Herbivores, which eat plants and other primary producers, are primary consumers. Carnivores that eat herbivores are secondary consumers, and carnivores that eat other carnivores are tertiary consumers. Another important group of heterotrophs consists of detritivores. Detritivores or decomposers are consumers that get their energy from detritus, which is non-living organic material such as the remains of dead organisms, feces, fallen leaves and wood. Many detritivores are in turn eaten by secondary and tertiary consumers. 2 important groups of detritivores are prokaryotes and fungi.
So here we have an overview of energy and nutrient dynamics in an ecosystem. Energy enters, flows through and exits an ecosystem, whereas chemical nutrients cycle within it. Energy, the dark orange arrows, enter from the sun as radiation and then transferred as chemical energy through the food web. Each of these units of energy ultimately exits as heat radiated into space. Most transfers of nutrients, the blue arrows, through the food web lead eventually to detritus. The nutrients then cycle back to the primary producers.
So let's have a look at energy and other limiting factors controlling primary production in ecosystems. Now, the amount of light energy converted to chemical energy in the form of organic compounds by autotrophs during a given time period is the ecosystem's primary production. In most ecosystems, primary producers use light energy to synthesize energy-rich organic molecules, and consumers acquire their organic fuels second-hand or even third or fourth-hand through food webs. So what is the global energy budget? Well, every day the Earth's atmosphere is bombarded by about 10 to the 22 joules of solar radiation. Now, this is enough energy to supply the demands of the entire population for many years. Now, most solar radiation is absorbed, scattered or reflected by clouds and dust in the atmosphere. The amount of solar radiation that ultimately reaches the Earth's surface limits the possible photosynthetic output of ecosystems. As a result, only about 1% of the visible light that strikes photosynthetic organisms is converted to chemical energy by photosynthesis. Nevertheless, Earth's primary producers collectively create about 150 billion metric tons of organic material each year. So what is gross and net primary production? Total primary production in an ecosystem is known as that ecosystem's gross primary production, GPP, the amount of light energy that is converted to chemical energy by photosynthesis per unit time. Not all of this production is stored as organic material in the primary producers because they use some of the molecules as fuel in their own cellular respiration. The net primary production, NPP, is equal to the gross primary production minus the energy used by the primary producers for respiration. Now, the NPP can be calculated using the equation below. In many ecosystems, NPP is about 1/2 of GPP. To ecologists, net primary production is the key measurement because it represents the storage of chemical energy that will be available to consumers in the ecosystem. So net primary production can be expressed as energy per unit area per unit time, or as biomass added to the ecosystem per unit area per unit time. Images produced from satellite data show that different ecosystems vary significantly in their NPP. Now, tropical rainforests are among the most productive terrestrial ecosystems and contribute a large portion of the planet's overall NPP. Estuaries and coral reefs also have a very high net primary production, but their contribution to the global total is relatively small because these ecosystems cover only about 1/10 the area covered by tropical rainforests. So what is the net ecosystem production, the NEP? Well, this is defined as gross primary production minus the total respiration of all organisms in the system, the RT, not just primary producers. Now, the NEP is represented as an equation below. So NEP equals GPP minus RT. A common way to estimate the NEP is to measure the net flow of CO2 or O2 entering or leaving the ecosystem. So let's have a look at primary production in the aquatic ecosystem and light limitation. In aquatic, marine and freshwater ecosystems, both light and nutrients are important in controlling primary production. Because solar radiation drives photosynthesis, you might expect that light is a key variable in controlling primary production in oceans. Indeed, the depth of light penetration affects primary production throughout the photic zone of an ocean or lake. About half the solar radiation is absorbed in the first 15 meters of water. Even in clear water, only 5 to 10% of the radiation may reach a depth of 75 meters. If light were the main variable limiting primary production in the ocean, we would expect production to increase along a gradient from the poles towards the equator, which receives the greatest intensity of light. However, as you can see from the previous slide, that there is no such gradient. Another factor must influence primary production in the ocean.